Good afternoon, and welcome to the class. This afternoon I'm going to talk to you about Aristotle's ethics. Aristotle is not the first philosopher to write about ethics.
But
he is the first philosopher to write a systematic work about ethics. We will talk at the end of the class about some of the earlier philosophers who wrote about ethics. But first of all, let us see what Aristotle himself has to say about ethics. Ethics for Aristotle is not a science. At least it is not a science in the true sense of science. For Aristotle, there are only three real sciences. The first and most important science we talked about yesterday, namely metaphysics. The second science for Aristotle is physics. And the third science is mathematics. And so, of course, you might be very surprised to hear that metaphysics is considered to be a science by Aristotle. I will try to say a few words about this question in my talk on Thursday. Then, after the top three sciences for Aristotle, we come to what he calls practical sciences. So the practical sciences are ethics, politics, and rhetoric. And they are not real sciences. They are not real sciences because they involve human freedom. So a real science is something completely unchanging. But human beings are not predictable and have freedom, and so what they do cannot be a science. So, of course, this is an important point, namely that human beings are free. So Aristotle has no doubt about this point. Human beings are free, that is to say, they can choose what they do, and they are responsible for their actions.
არისტოტელე არ ეჭვობს ის შესახებ, რომ ადამიანებს თავისუფლება აქვთ, მათ აქვთ არჩევანის უნარი და შესაბამისად აღპასუხისმგებლობაც.
And when human beings act in a way that is praiseworthy, we call that a virtue.
როდესაც ადამიანები იქცევიან, რომ ის შეხედვის ღირსი, ჩვენ მას საცნობებს ვეძახით.
And when human beings act in a way that we condemn, then we blame them and we punish them.
როდესაც ადამიანები იქცევიან, როდესაც ჩვენ არ ვიტანხმებით და მას ბრალს ვწერთ და ამაცა არ მოგწონს.
But of course it would be very unjust to punish people if they were not free and if they were not responsible.
მაგრამ უსამართლო იქნებოდა თუ ადამიანს იმის დაშით, რომ მათ არ ექნებოდა არჩევანის და თავისუფალი არჩევანის უფლება.
So ethics, then we can say, is the study of how people should act.
ანუ ეთიკა არის მისება იმ შესახებ თუ როგორ უნდა იქცეოდნენ ადამიანები.
It's not the study of how they do act, because that is sociology.
ანუ არ არის შესახებ თუ როგორ იქცევიან, იმიტომ რომ სოციოლოგიის კითხვა.
But the study of how they should act if they wanted to act well.
ანუ იმ შესახებ თუ როგორ უნდა მოიქცნენ, თუნდაც რომ კარგად ჩვენთვის მათ იქცევენ, კარგი იყოს.
But of course everybody knows that human beings all know that there are certain rules in life. And sometimes we follow the rules and sometimes we don't. Now, Aristotle says that because ethics is not a science, we have to use a special method for studying ethics.
არისტოტელე ამბობს, რომ რადგან ეთიკა მეცნიერება არ არის, ამიტომ რაღაც კონკრეტული მეთოდი უნდა გამოვიყენოთ ამისთვის.
And this method he calls dialectic.
და მეთოდს იგი დიალექტიკას უწოდებს.
The word dialectic has a different meaning in almost every philosopher.
დიალექტიკას თვითონ სიტყვას სხვა ფილოსოფოსისთვის განსხვავებული მნიშვნელობები აქვს.
It has a different meaning for Plato, has a different meaning, as you know, probably for Karl Marx. But for Aristotle, dialectic means that we study the opinions of the people who went before.
მაგრამ არისტოტელესთვის დიალექტიკა არის იმის შესწავლა, თუ ჩვენს წინ ვიყავ ამათი მოსაზრებების შესწავლა.
So the wise philosophers of the past.
ანუ წარსულის ძველი ფილოსოფოსების.
And also we take into account the way that ordinary people act.
ასევე ჩვენ მითვალისწინებთ იმას, თუ როგორ იქცევა ჩვეულებრივი ხალხი.
Because Aristotle says that this is the most likely way to reach truth. So the philosophers from the past are not likely to be completely wrong. And also ordinary people who use common sense are also not likely to be completely wrong. And when we have brought together all the opinions of the wise men from the past and the ordinary people, then it's necessary to compare them and to make a good judgment.
როდესაც ჩვენ ერთად ვიღებთ წარსული ფილოსოფოსების და ჩვეულებრივი ადამიანების მოსაზრებებს, ჩვენ უნდა გავსაჯოთ და შევადაროთ ეს მოსაზრება.
Of course, this good judgment will be the judgment of Aristotle.
რა თქმა უნდა, კარგი გაშა იქნება ეს არისტოტელეს გაშა შესახებ.
Good. Now, Aristotle also says that ethics requires experience of life.
არისტოტელე ასევე ამბობს, რომ ეთიკას სჭირდება ცხოვრების გამოცდილება.
He says that young people usually are led in life by their feelings.
ახალგაზრდები უფრო თამიანთი გრძნობების მიხედვით მოქმედებენ.
And as a result, they make a lot of mistakes.
ამ შედეგად ბევრ შეცდომას უშობენ.
But if you have experience, then you will be better able to judge how to act in ethics.
მაგრამ თუ კარგი გამოცდილება გაქვს, გამოცდილება გაქვს დაგროვილი, უკეთ ეცოდინება თუ როგორ უნდა გაწოდოს კარგი მოქმედების შესახებ ეთიკაში.
Now we have from Aristotle, as we said yesterday, not his published works. We have notes, which are either Aristotle's own notes or the notes taken by his students.
ჩვენ როგორც უშუალოდ ვისაუბრეთ, გვაქვს არა კონკრეტულად არისტოტელის მიერ გამოქვეყნებული ნაშრომები, არამედ ის შემჩნევი და ჩანაწერები, რომლებიც ან მისი, ან მისი სტუდენტების მიერ არის გაკეთებული.
And three ethical works have been handed down to us under the name of Aristotle.
არისტოტელეს სახელით ჩვენ მოგვეცა სამი ნაშრომი.
The first of these is the most famous. It's the Nicomachean Ethics. The name Nicomachean comes from Aristotle's son, who was Nicomachus. Who is said to have been killed in a battle at the age of 17. Then the second ethical treatise under the name of Aristotle is called the Eudemian Ethics. It's not completely clear why. But then the third ethical treatise is called the Magna Moralia, which means the great ethical work. Really, it's not any bigger than the other two, but the books are bigger. There are only two books of the great ethics. That may be the reason why it's called the great ethics. Up to 1923, so less than 100 years ago, the Nicomachean Ethics was thought to be the only real ethics of Aristotle. But after the publication of an important work in 1923 called Aristotle, by one of the greatest German scholars on Aristotle called Werner Jaeger, it was accepted that the Eudemian Ethics is also genuinely by Aristotle. But Jaeger put forward the idea that the Eudemian Ethics is the earliest work of Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics is latest work. In the meantime, it has been shown that the three middle books of the Nicomachean Ethics were written at the same time as the Eudemian Ethics. And so it is more and more likely that the Eudemian Ethics is the later work. Because we have 10 books of Nicomachean Ethics, but if the middle three belong to the Eudemian Ethics, that makes only 7. And if the three books in the middle of the Nicomachean Ethics belong to the Eudemian Ethics, then there are 8 books of Eudemian Ethics. If the three middle ones of the Nicomachean Ethics belong with the Eudemian Ethics, then there are 8 books of Eudemian Ethics.
Oh, I see. Მაგრამ თუ ნიკომაქეს ეთიკიდან სამი ეკუთვნის ეუდემონის ეთიკას, მაშინ ეუდემონის ეთიკა გამოდის უკვე 8 წიგნი და არა 3.
So it's a little bit complicated, and there are many more reasons, but if you want to know the opinion of Dadli, the Eudemian Ethics is later than the Nicomachean Ethics, and the last work is the Magna Moralia, and it is really by Aristotle. Okay, but the Nicomachean Ethics is still the best known one, the one that is most studied, and also the most literary work. Okay. Now, the starting words of the Nicomachean Ethics are very famous. Aristotle says that everything seeks the good. And so the good can be defined as that which everything seeks. And that sentence is often understood as meaning that all human beings seek their good. But if you were here yesterday, you will have heard me saying that also for Aristotle, everything, not only living beings, but also non-living beings, also seek their good. And so this first sentence of the Ethics, in a way, can bring together physics and ethics. So non-living things and plants and animals, but also human beings seek what is good for them. And Aristotle then says that everybody is agreed, both the wise men from the past and ordinary people, everybody is agreed that what we are looking for in life is happiness. And since the time of Aristotle, almost every philosopher has agreed that what human beings are looking for in life is happiness. The one philosopher who denies this is the famous German philosopher Kant.
ერთ-ერთი მნიშვნელოვანი ფილოსოფიის რომელიც ამას აერთიანება არის გერმანიის ფილოსოფიის კანტი.
But if you look carefully at what Kant has to say and you turn it around a little bit, I think maybe even Kant agrees with it.
თუმცა თუ საკმაოდ უდასმით შეისწავლით კანტის ნაშრომს, ალბათ სავარაუდოა რომ კანტიც ეთანხმება რაღაცნაირად ამ თვალსაზრისით.
Okay, but I'm not going to talk about Kant. Now, the big question for Aristotle then is not what we are looking for in life, because that is clear, we're looking for happiness. The question is how to achieve happiness.
დიდი კითხვა არისტოტელესთან არის ის როგორ მივაღწიოთ ბედნიერებას, რადგან უკვე ცნობილია ის თუ რა არის ადამიანისკენ მისწრაფვის ადამიანი.
So Aristotle says, following his method, that we must examine the different ways of life that we see in society around us.
არისტოტელე ამბობს, რომ ჩვენ უნდა გავარკვიოთ იმ გზების შესახებ, რომელთაც საზოგადოება ცხოვრობს.
So the first way of life we see is the life of the slave.
პირველი ასეთი ცხოვრების გზა არის მონის ცხოვრება.
And Aristotle says it's clear that the life of a slave is not the way to happiness.
და ცხადია რომ მონის ცხოვრება არც არ მიყავს იგი ბედნიერებამდე.
The second way of life is the life of money making.
მეორე გზა არის ფულის მკეთებლობის გზა.
A large number of people spend all their life trying to make money.
ძალიან ბევრი ადამიანი ცხოვრება ატარებს მაშინ როგორ მოიხაჭოს.
But Aristotle says that this is also not the way to happiness.
მაგრამ არისტოტელე ასევე ამბობს რომ ეს არ არის ის გზა რომელსაც ბედნიერებამდე მივყავართ.
Because money is only a means to be used in order to achieve a purpose.
მაგრამ ფული არის მიზანი იმისთვის რომ მივაღწიოთ საშუალება სწორედ რომ მივაღწიოთ ბედნიერებას.
And so money cannot be the same thing as happiness.
ამიტომ ფული არ იქნება იგივე რაც ბედნიერება.
And there are many examples of very rich people who are very unhappy. You probably all know the story of King Kursis, who wanted to have everything he touched turn into King Midas wanted everything he touched to turn to gold. And everything he touched when he got up in the morning turned into gold. Even his children turned into gold, and then he was very unhappy. So this story, of course, is to show that gold is not everything. Then the third way of life Aristotle examines in society is the life of people who seek pleasure.
A
large number of people devote all their life to seeking pleasure. And there are even philosophers who believe that the purpose of life is pleasure. For example, Democritus and Epicurus. In ancient times and also in modern times, the philosophy of Bentham and Mill. But Aristotle has a very low opinion of pleasure.
მაგრამ არისტოტელე ძალიან ცუდად განსხვავებული სიამოვნების მიმართ.
He says that people who seek only pleasure in life as their top priority are like cattle.
და ის ამბობს, რომ ადამიანები, რომლებიც ყოველ სიამოვნებას ესწრაფვიან, პირუტყვებით არიან.
Then the fourth way of life he examines in order to find happiness is the life of politics.
მეოთხე ტიპის ცხოვრების განხილავს ეს არის პოლიტიკოსის ცხოვრება პოლიტიკის.
So some people spend all their lives looking for power and honor in politics.
ზოგი ადამიანი პოლიტიკას იმაში ატარებს, რომ იპოვოს ძალაუფლება,
power and honor.
და ღირსება.
But Aristotle says this also cannot be the happiness that people are looking for.
არისტოტელე ამბობს, რომ ეს არ არის ის ბედნიერება, რომელსაც ადამიანები შედგება ისწრაფებდნენ.
Because the honor that you get and the power you get in politics depends on other people.
რადგან ძალაუფლება და ღირსება, რასაც ჩვენ ვიღებთ, დამოკიდებული არის სხვა ადამიანებზე.
And the day that you lose power or the day that people do not honor you, then you lose your happiness.
რადგან მაშინ იმ წამს, როდესაც ადამიანი კარგავს ძალაუფლებას ან აღარ არის ღირსეული სხვების ფალში, ის უბედური ხდება.
Then the fifth way of life Aristotle examines is the life of moral virtue.
მეხუთე გზა არის მორალური სიკეთის გზა.
And Aristotle says that this is indeed a way to certain happiness. Virtue is something which necessarily will make you happy. But it doesn't give the best happiness according to Aristotle. Because there is an even higher happiness, he says, and this comes from the life of contemplation. So Aristotle concludes from his examination of the different ways of life that the two that will give us happiness, permanent happiness, are moral virtue and contemplation. Now, Aristotle wants to give a foundation to his ethics. So he says that in order to approach happiness, ethics and happiness correctly, we need to understand human nature. In order to understand ethics and happiness, we need to study human nature. So human nature, according to Aristotle, is the human being is composed of body and soul. So human beings have a body like all other animals. But he says that the human soul is superior to the soul of animals. Because human beings are rational. So human beings have the use of abstractions. Human beings are able to deliberate. And they're able to take a decision. And they are free to take the decision. So in this way, human beings are superior to animals. And this shows they have another component in their soul. So their soul is not just the soul of a plant, which enables the plant to grow. It's not just the soul of an animal, which can grow and which has feelings. But the human soul is able to grow and it's able to feel, but it's also able to reason. And Aristotle divides reason into two parts. He says there is one part which is able to deliberate and to reason. But there's even a more important part which is able to contemplate. And to have knowledge of the sciences. And for Aristotle, it's more important to be able to contemplate and to have knowledge of the sciences than to be able to reason. So Aristotle will base his ethics on these two higher parts of the soul. So this is a rather controversial part of Aristotle's ethics. Because in order to discover where to find happiness, he decides to eliminate the two parts of the soul which human beings have in common with plants and animals. Yes. In order to discover where to find happiness, he decides to examine the parts of the soul that human beings have in common with plants and animals. So he eliminates the part of the soul that enables us to grow. And he eliminates the part of the soul that has feelings. And he concentrates exclusively on the two parts of the soul that are reason. So the reasoning power and the contemplative power. So it's a little bit doubtful whether this procedure is a good one. Now, Aristotle says that in order to achieve happiness, we must act in a certain way. So, for Aristotle, there are two sources of happiness. And these two sources, we said, are moral virtue and contemplation. But in addition, Aristotle says there are some conditions of happiness. So this is an interesting point. For Aristotle, we have sources of happiness and conditions of happiness.
არისტოტელესთან ჩვენ გვაქვს წყარო ბედნიერების და ასევე წინაპირობები ბედნიერების.
So the sources of happiness will necessarily make us happy.
ბედნიერების წყაროები აუცილებლად მოგვანიჭებს ბედნიერებას.
But the conditions will not make us happy.
მაგრამ ეს წინაპირობები არ გაგვხდის ბედნიერს.
But without the conditions of happiness, we will not have the best or the highest happiness.
მაგრამ ამ წინაპირობების გარეშე ჩვენ არ გვექნება საუკეთესო, ყველაზე მაღალი ბედნიერება.
So we have then a list of what Aristotle calls external goods.
ჩვენ გვაქვს სია, რასაც არისტოტელე უწოდებს დამატებითთან გარეგან სიკეთეებს.
So I think you have the page called Aristotle's list of external goods. And on this page you will see the conditions of happiness.
და მოგვეცა შეგძლებთ ითილოთ წინაპირობები ბედნიერების.
So first of all, Aristotle says that in order to be fully happy, you need to have good health.
არისტოტელე ამბობს, რომ იმისთვის, რომ ადამიანი იყოს სრულად ბედნიერი, მას უნდა ჰქონდეს საბჭოთა.
So I think most people will agree with this, that if you have bad health, you're not going to be very happy. But at the same time, just because you have health doesn't mean you will be happy. So health is a condition of happiness, but it's not a source of happiness. Second external good, second condition of happiness, Aristotle says, is food. So you must have food in order to be happy. Likewise, clothing, if you need to have clothes, and also housing, you need to have somewhere to live. So all of these things are rather obvious, but for Aristotle they are necessary conditions to have full happiness. But Aristotle is interested not just in ordinary happiness, not just the happiness that most of us will be happy to have. He is interested in finding absolutely perfect happiness. And so you see further down the page that there are some more indispensable conditions of perfect happiness. So he says to be absolutely perfectly happy, you must be born into a distinguished family. You also need to have satisfactory children. Because there is nothing worse than to have children, and if they turn out badly, they will spoil your happiness. And also, it is important not to be ugly. Because if you are ugly, according to Aristotle, you won't be fully happy. Also, there are some goods that are instrumentally useful for happiness. Instrumentally.
და არის ზოგი სიკეთე, რაც ინსტრუმენტალურად არის მნიშვნელოვანი სპეციალისტების.
First of all, strength. So if you are a weak person, you don't have much energy, it will be hard to be virtuous.
პირველი არის ძალა, ძლიერი, თუ ადამიანი არის სუსტი, ის ვერ იქნება მკვერი.
Also, you need to have opportunities in life. Also, it's important to have friends in order that you can exercise virtues towards them. And also, you need to have wealth. Well, we will see not too much, but you need to have at least enough money in order to be able to be generous. And also he says political power, that means you need to have connections with people so that also you can help your friends. So these 5 instrumentally useful goods are good also as means to achieving happiness. So Aristotle is, if you like, a perfectionist. He says that real happiness, perfect happiness, is lacking nothing. But he says that we must be careful with these conditions of happiness. We must not confuse the conditions with the sources of happiness. Because that would be like attributing a brilliant concert to the instrument and not to the player. So the instrument is important, but the player who plays the instrument is more important. So we should choose the amount of these external goods that will help us most to be virtuous. Now, Aristotle also says that in order to achieve perfect happiness, you also need to live a certain number of years. So the Greek term for this is a bios teleios, means a perfect life, or a full or complete life. And the question is, of course, how long do you need to live in order to achieve a full life? And he says, well, clearly it's not enough if you die young. It's necessary to have lived for at least to your maturity and probably, I guess, to about the age of 50.
აუცილებელია რომ მოწვეულობას მიაღწიოს ადამიანმა და
Yes, it's necessary to have lived at least to your maturity, and possibly, I would say, to the age of 50. We should remember that Aristotle is the most important pupil of Plato. And Plato was only willing to allow his philosophers to contemplate the idea of the good at the age of 50. So, even though Aristotle doesn't say it, probably by a full or complete life he means the age of 50. And he says that if you have not these external conditions, then your life will not be fully happy. And he gives a very famous example, the example of King Priam of Troy. So Troy is the very famous city today on the northwest coast of Turkey. And this city was captured by the Greeks after 10 years of war. In Homer's Iliad, I don't know if you read Homer's Iliad today, but the story is the siege of Troy for 10 years by the Greeks. And in the end, by using the wooden horse, the Greeks captured the city of Troy. And the city was burned. And King Priam was the king of Troy, and he had a perfectly happy life. He was extremely rich, and he had 50 sons and 50 daughters. 50, yes. And then at the end of his life, he had a terrible tragedy because his city was burned and his 50 sons and his 50 daughters were killed in front of his eyes. And so Aristotle says it's clear that this man, King Priam, he did not have a happy life. Because he ended badly. So you can see from this example that happiness for Aristotle is not just a feeling of happiness, but it is really the complete perfection of human life. And so I should say something about this at the end. I should say something about this before we conclude. So there's a difference between feeling happy and achieving the perfect life.
განსხვავება არის ბედნიერების შეგრძნებასა და სრულყოფის სიცოცხლეს შორის.
Okay, I have to hurry up a little bit. Now, let us turn to the sources of happiness. So we said that there are two sources of happiness which necessarily will make you happy. So the first source of happiness, Aristotle says, is moral virtue. So in order to know what is a virtue, again, Aristotle uses his method of seeing what wise men say and ordinary people. And from his examination of what people say are praiseworthy actions, he makes a list of 13 virtues. So you have the handout and you can see that the virtues are in the middle of the page. And always for Aristotle, a virtue is the middle between too little and too much. So you can see the first moral virtue of Aristotle is courage. I put it also in Greek each time underneath, but that's only if you know Greek, it will help you. But in English first and then in Greek. So courage is the virtue, but if you are not courageous, if you are lacking in courage, then you are a coward. But if you are not just courageous, but you run into battle and you get killed immediately, you are not courageous. So courage does not mean throwing away your life. Somebody who simply goes into battle and gets killed without any care is rash. They are not courageous. Then the second virtue is temperance, which is moderation. It means you take the right amount of pleasure in something, not too much and not too little. And in fact, it's very close to the idea of self-control. Because self-control is really not taking too much pleasure. It's able to control the amount of pleasure you take in something. If if you take too much pleasure in life, Aristotle says that's not a virtue, that for him is profligacy. So I don't know if you can translate this word. No, you take too much pleasure. Someone who is all the time eating chocolate is a profligate. Someone who likes too much food. Someone who likes too much of every kind of pleasure. Yes. So there is a famous book by Petronius in the 1st century AD describing the dinners eaten by the Emperor King Nero. Yeah, you have heard of the Emperor Nero of Rome. Yeah, and when they finished dinner, they would get sick, so they could eat again. Okay. Now, the third virtue is generosity, liberality, or generosity. And it's defined as the mean, so the average, in getting and giving money. And then, if you are not generous enough, if you will not give any money to anybody at all, then you are mean. But if you go into the street and you give away all your money, then you are prodigal. So generous is a mean, it's in the middle between two extremes. Now the fourth virtue, you can see Aristotle took it from looking at the life of rich people. This is the virtue of magnificence. It's a virtue only for very rich people. But if you are very, very rich, then you also need to know how to use your money. So, supposing you are very, very rich and you want to build a building at the university with your name on it. Then you might decide you will give only $1 million. It's not enough to build a building. So then you're paltry or niggardly in English. It's kind of meanness. You're very, very rich, but you don't give enough. You want to build a building, but you don't give enough. But if you decide you want to build this building and put a gold roof on it, and you make it too luxurious, then this is vulgarity. Because you are just showing how much money you have. So this is a virtue only for rich people. Then the fifth virtue is called greatness of soul. But it means the desiring the right amount of great honors.
ანუ ეს არის როდესაც ადამიანს სურს სწორი რაოდენობა ღირსების პატრის.
So if you are an important person, you should desire a certain amount of respect and honor. If you are an important person, and if you don't expect a certain amount of honor or respect, then you are not desiring enough honor. If you don't desire enough respect, but if you want everybody to go on their knees before you, that is desiring too much honor. So that is vanity. You think you are too important. Okay. The sixth virtue is ambition. So everybody should have a certain amount of ambition. It's not a good thing if you do not have any ambitions. But at the same time, you must not have too many ambitions or desire things that are completely impossible. Okay. The seventh virtue is gentleness or patience. So you should react if people are not just towards you. You should react. You should do something. If you allow everybody to treat you badly, then that is not enough. But if you get angry very easily, that's also not good. So the middle is to accept a certain amount, to be patient, but only patient to a certain extent. Then the eighth virtue is having a proper estimate of yourself. Yeah, so we often call it humility. So the lack or deficiency is an inferiority complex. If you think you are no good, then you have an inferiority complex. But if you think you are better than everybody else, then you have a superiority complex. So you should be somewhere in the middle. Then the ninth virtue is wittiness. So you should be able to be entertaining when you are talking to other people. So it's not good if you have no sense of humor at all. But it's also not good if you are laughing at everything. Then you are like a clown. Then the 10th virtue is friendliness. So we should be polite to everybody. Polite to everybody, friendly to everybody. Yeah. It's not good if you are difficult, you are not nice to everybody. But it's too much if you are all the time flattering everybody, you are telling everybody how good they are. Then the 11th virtue is modesty. Modesty means that you are not trying to say everything good you have done. You are not trying to make yourself too important. If you are too shy, then you are not willing to say anything good about yourself. But it's also not good if you say all the wonderful things you have done to everybody. Then the 12th virtue, it is where you are not pleased when you see something unjust. So the bad side is when you are pleased that somebody else has bad luck. So that is malice or spite. Yeah. And the opposite is where you are envious, where you are not happy when other people have good things. Okay, and the last virtue, as you see, is justice. And justice, it's only justice if it's in the middle. It cannot be too much or too little or too much. So these are the 13 moral virtues of Aristotle. And these virtues are completely original in Aristotle, except for 3 of them. Aristotle takes over the 4 cardinal virtues which he got from Socrates. Yes. So Socrates is very famous for his invention or discovery of the 4 cardinal virtues. So wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. Wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. These are the 4 cardinal virtues. I'll explain them. Yeah, it's okay. I'll explain them. Yeah, so wisdom, as you see, is not on the list of Aristotle's moral virtues. That is because it is an intellectual virtue. But but the other three are moral virtues. So, courage, temperance, and justice are moral virtues. So Aristotle accepts the four cardinal virtues from Socrates, and Plato accepted them also.
არისტოტელე სოკრატესგან იღებს ამ ოთხ კარდინალურ საცნოებას, ისევე როგორც პლატონი.
But we will see that justice is different for Aristotle and for Plato.
მაგრამ არისტოტელესთვის და პლატონისთვის სამართალობა განსხვავებულია.
Now I have to hurry a little bit. There are some important things to know about moral virtue. The first thing is, in order to become virtuous, you need to have a good education. So, virtue is a habit. A habit which means that at the right time you have to apply a certain virtue. At the right time you have to apply or use the right virtue. And so, if you don't have the right training or the right education, you will not have this virtue. It's extremely difficult to acquire a virtue if you don't have it through your education. Now, a moral virtue, as we saw, is in the middle between two extremes. But once you have a virtue, you cannot have too much. So some people are a little bit generous, some people are more generous, some people are very generous. But it does not mean that you're throwing your money away if you are very generous. It just means you have a high degree of virtue. Then it's important to do the right action at the right time. So a virtue depends for being virtuous on being done at the right time. Not all actions for Aristotle are a middle between two extremes. This only applies to the virtues. But some actions are always bad. And Aristotle gives three examples which are interesting. He says, adultery, theft, and murder are always bad. Adultery, stealing, and murder. Yes, these are always bad. So it's not a question of stealing a little bit or too much. No, stealing is always bad. And in fact, if we compare Aristotle's ethics with the Ten Commandments in the Bible, we can see that Aristotle would agree with all of them. Now, for Aristotle, in order to perform the right virtue at the right time, we need to have practical wisdom. Practical wisdom is a virtue of the lower part of the intellect. So we said there are two parts of the intellect. There's the reasoning part and the contemplative part. So practical wisdom is a virtue of the reasoning part. So we have to reason to know which virtue we should apply at a certain time. So this virtue of practical wisdom, it's reasoning about the right virtue to apply, and also the self-control to apply it. Yes. I say a quick word about pleasure. Aristotle says that pleasure is an activity or possibly it's not a good translation. It could be more a realization. So it is an accomplishment or a realization of the activity that it accompanies. Accomplishment, so the fulfilling. So pleasure is a realization or perfection, an accomplishment of the activity it perfects. So for example, if you are reading a book, it will give you pleasure to read this book. And so the pleasure will be something extra, a kind of realization that goes together with the activity. But for Aristotle, some pleasures are not real pleasures. So he says some pleasures are bad pleasures. For example, pleasures taken in doing something bad. And in the Eudemian ethics, he even says that even the pleasures of restoring are not real pleasures. So eating and drinking are restoring pleasures. So even these are not real pleasures for Aristotle. So the real pleasures are the pleasures that accompany something that is intellectual. Okay, that's as much as I can say about that one. And I think we have to turn to the highest source of happiness. For Aristotle, the highest source of happiness is contemplation. And there has been a lot of discussion about the meaning of this word contemplation. Because of course we need to know that Aristotle was living before Christ, before Christianity. So his contemplation is not a religious contemplation. But at the same time, it is not enough to say that contemplation for Aristotle is just philosophy. Or just studying the sciences. For Aristotle, the contemplation seems to be the study of the sciences, but with a purpose. And this purpose would probably be in order to improve his study of metaphysics. And finally to come to a contemplation of his God. Because he does talk about the pleasure of contemplating God. And he says that this pleasure is the greatest pleasure, but it only lasts for a short time. But he says we can get much more pleasure for a longer time from studying the sciences. So probably the two ideas go together, the idea of studying all the sciences, which he did in his own life. As well as the idea of contemplating God. Now, I would like to conclude with saying a few words about the place of Aristotle's ethics in philosophy. Aristotle's ethics so I said at the start that Aristotle was not the first philosopher to study ethics. The first philosopher who studied ethics was Pythagoras. And Pythagoras introduced into Western philosophy the idea of the immortality of the soul. And he believed in the transmigration of the soul, or the reincarnation of the soul. So if you led a good life, you could go to a kind of heaven. But if you led a bad life, your soul would come back on earth as the soul of some kind of animal. And this was a punishment for leading a bad life. And this belief in the reincarnation was taken over by the philosopher Heraclitus and also by Empedocles and by Plato. So Plato believed in the immortality of the soul, but if you did not lead a good life, you would come back either as a fish or an animal or a bird. And so this reincarnation was a kind of punishment for leading a bad life. Now Aristotle did not believe in a life after death. So for Aristotle there is no punishment for leading a bad life. He says the only punishment for leading a bad life is that you lose your happiness. But he says at the end of his Nicomachean Ethics, in the very last chapter, he says that ethical treatises are really of no value at all, except for a couple of young people. Young people. So just a few young people will be interested in ethics and it will change their life. So really I have been talking to most of you for nothing. But for a few young people maybe it was worthwhile a little bit. But he says that for most people what is necessary is politics. Because politics means laws, and laws mean sanctions and punishments. Sanctions means sanction is kind of punishment. So if you go through the red traffic light, the police will come. Yeah. So Aristotle says that most people need to be restrained by laws with punishments. Punishments if you don't obey. And so it's interesting that if you compare the two kinds of ethics, either you have ethics with a life after death, where the punishment comes after death, or else you have a kind of ethics where Aristotle says, well, we hope that some of you will learn something and be inspired by the good.
ვიღაც მაინც რაღაც ნაწილი ადამიანის მაინც ისწავლის რამეს ანტიკისგან.
But really most people, they will only be restrained by laws with punishments.
მაგრამ უმეტესობა ადამიანის მაინც ადამიანისთვის მაინც იქნება საჭირო კანონები, რომ შეიცვლოს მათი მოქმედება.
But anyway, let us hope for us that we will be inspired by the good. Okay, well, I would like to talk for another 2 hours, but time is limited.